It started as any other shift, the kind that blurs into the background, a repetitive routine of charting vitals and distributing medications. But that night, it all changed. My name is Dr. James Hartley, and I've spent nearly 2 decades working in hospitals, witnessing life's most fragile moments, but nothing prepared me for room 104. It was a bitter winter evening, the kind that makes your breath curl into the air like smoke. The snow outside had blanketed the world in silence, and the fluorescent lights inside the hospital flickered as if the storm had reached inside. The corridors were empty, save for the occasional distant murmur of a nurse or the soft beeping of monitors. I had just finished my rounds when a young nurse, Rebecca, approached me with a peculiar request. "Dr. Hartley, could you take a look at Mrs. Eleanor in room 104? She's been complaining of strange things." Rebecca's voice wavered as she spoke, her usual calm demeanor replaced with something close to fear. "What kind of strange things?" I asked, already feeling a chill creep down my spine. "She says she's seeing people in her room. Shadows, she called them. And, the temperature. It's unusually cold in there." I frowned. The building's heating system was old, prone to malfunctions, but something in Rebecca's eyes told me this was more than just a draft. "I'll check it out." Room 104 was at the far end of the corridor, isolated, almost as if the hospital itself wanted to keep it separate. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through. The temperature did drop as I got closer, a biting cold that felt out of place, even in the dead of winter. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the small lamp beside Eleanor's bed. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist as if alive. I shook off the feeling of unease and walked over to the elderly woman lying on the bed. "Mrs. Eleanor," I whispered, not wanting to startle her. She turned her head slowly to look at me, her eyes wide, pupils dilated with fear. "Dr. Hartley," she breathed, her voice trembling. "They're here. They've been watching me all night." "Who's watching you?" I asked, glancing around the room. There was no one there, just the usual hospital equipment and the steady beep of the heart monitor. But the cold, it was almost unbearable now. "The shadows," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They stand in the corners. They whisper to each other, but I can't understand what they're saying. And then they look at me." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to reason with myself, to dismiss her words as the ramblings of an elderly woman in a state of delirium. But the way she spoke, the terror in her eyes, made it impossible to ignore. "Let's check your vitals," I said, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. I reached for the thermometer on the bedside table, but as I did, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. In that instant, I felt something move in the corner of my vision, a shadow shifting where there shouldn't have been any movement. The lights returned, and everything was as it had been, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I forced myself to smile at Eleanor, but she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on something behind me. "They're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're right behind you." I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The corner of the room was empty, but the shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were swallowing the light. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon her. "I'm going to get a nurse," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I backed out of the room, not taking my eyes off that corner, until I was in the hallway. The door swung shut with a soft click, and I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Rebecca was at the nurse's station when I found her. "There's something wrong with room 104, I said, my voice low. "I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's just the cold." She nodded, as if she had been expecting this. "You're not the first, Dr. Hartley. Several nurses have reported strange occurrences in that room. Cold spots, objects moving on their own, and the shadows." "Why hasn't it been investigated?" I demanded, feeling a surge of anger mixed with fear. "It has," she replied, her eyes dark with something like resignation. "But no one could find anything concrete. The hospital administration brought in paranormal investigators, but all they got were some inconclusive readings and EVPs, nothing they could take to the board." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "And what about Eleanor?" Rebecca hesitated. "She's been in and out of this hospital for years, always in room 104. She insists on it, says she has to be there." "Why?" "I don't know," Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper. "But whatever it is, it's getting stronger. I can feel it." I didn't sleep that night. My mind was consumed by thoughts of Eleanor and the shadows in room 104. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by sitting in my office waiting for the night to end. So I made a decision, a reckless, desperate decision. I went back to room 104. The hallway was deathly quiet as I approached the door. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, the only sound in a building that seemed to have fallen into an uneasy slumber. I paused outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. This time the door was firmly shut, but the cold radiated through the wood, a tangible barrier between me and whatever lay inside. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was as I had left it, but the atmosphere was even more oppressive, the darkness thicker, almost tangible. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, staring at me with those wide, terrified eyes. "You came back," she said, her voice hollow. "I need to know what's happening here," I replied, stepping further into the room. "Why do you stay in this room, Mrs. Eleanor? Why do you insist on it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. "I can't leave," she whispered. "They won't let me." "Who won't let you?" "The shadows," she said, her voice breaking. "They've been with me for years, watching, waiting. I think they're here for me, Dr. Hartley. They're waiting for me to die." A chill ran through me. "That's not true," I said, more to convince myself than her. "You're not going to die." But even as I said the words, the heart monitor let out a series of sharp, irregular beeps. I spun around, my heart racing, only to see Eleanor clutching her chest, her face twisted in pain. "No!" I shouted, rushing to her side. But as I reached for the call button, the lights flickered again, and the room plunged into darkness. In that moment, I felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent, right beside me. The air around me seemed to vibrate with a low, inaudible hum, and then a whisper close to my ear, chilling me to my core. "She's ours." The lights came back on, and Eleanor was lying still, her chest no longer rising and falling. The heart monitor emitted a long, steady tone, a flat line. But what made my blood run cold was the look on her face. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something only she could see, a look of sheer terror, frozen in death. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse, growing darker, and for a split second, I saw them, figures, barely visible, watching me. And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the cold, empty room. The days that followed were a blur. Eleanor's death was ruled natural causes, a heart attack brought on by age and illness. But I knew better. Those shadows, whatever they were, had claimed her, and they had let me witness it. I transferred out of that hospital shortly after, unable to bear the weight of what I had experienced. But even now, in the stillness of the night, I feel them, watching, waiting in the shadows. And I know, deep down, that someday they'll come for me too. I had always been a skeptic, a man of science. Ghosts, spirits, and other paranormal phenomena were nothing more than the remnants of superstition. Stories concocted by those seeking to explain the unexplainable. But all of that changed the night I set foot in Cranbrook Asylum. It was supposed to be just another investigation, a chance to debunk the legends surrounding the abandoned asylum. Our team, known for its logical approach to ghost hunting, had debunked numerous haunted sites across the country. But Cranbrook was different. Its history was soaked in tragedy, abuse, neglect, and mysterious deaths that left a stain on its very walls. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, but that only fueled our curiosity. As we approached Cranbrook, the massive structure loomed against the night sky, its dark windows resembling hollow eyes staring back at us. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, a silence that felt too complete, too unnatural. We parked the van, the headlights cutting through the darkness and casting eerie shadows on the cracked facade of the building. I hesitated, just for a moment, before dismissing the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. We were here for answers, and nothing more. Our team consisted of 4 members: Sarah, the tech expert, Mark, the historian, James, our cameraman, and myself, the lead investigator. We had the usual equipment: EMF readers, digital recorders, thermal cameras, all meant to capture any anomalies that might arise. Sarah and Mark were already setting up in the main hall, a cavernous space that once held dozens of patients in its prime. Now, it was a shell of its former self, the walls cracked and peeling, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. "Let's split up," I suggested, the plan being to cover more ground. Mark and Sarah headed towards the east wing, while James and I moved toward the west wing, where the most notorious incidents were said to have occurred. The further we ventured into the asylum, the colder it became, the temperature dropping inexplicably. We passed by what must have been the nurses' station, the remnants of old files and medical supplies scattered across the floor. "This place is a gold mine for urban explorers," James whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. His camera whirred softly as it captured the eerie stillness. We reached the main ward, where dozens of patients were once housed. My EMF reader began to spike erratically as we entered, the needle jumping to life as if responding to something unseen. My skepticism wavered slightly, but I pushed it aside. There had to be a logical explanation, perhaps electrical wiring hidden within the walls. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound. I froze, holding my breath as I strained to listen. "Do you hear that?" I asked James, who nodded, his face pale in the dim light. The humming seemed to be coming from the far end of the hall, growing louder with each passing second. We followed the sound, the beam of our flashlights trembling as we moved deeper into the decaying asylum. The humming was soon accompanied by something else, something more sinister, a low, guttural moan that sent a shiver down my spine. We reached the last room on the right, its door hanging precariously from rusted hinges. The sounds were emanating from within. "Let's go in," I whispered, though my instincts screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. This was what we were here for: proof, evidence. We pushed open the door, and our flashlights illuminated an empty room, its walls bare and crumbling. Yet the humming and the moaning were all around us, as if the very air itself was alive. And then it happened. A sudden chill gripped me, and before I could react, something cold and unyielding wrapped around my wrist. A hand, icy and impossibly strong. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there. The hand released me just as quickly, leaving me shaken and breathless. "James? Did you?" I began. But he wasn't listening. His camera was pointed at the corner of the room, where the temperature had plummeted to near freezing. The moaning had intensified, now a chorus of voices, whispering, pleading, screaming. "We need to leave," James muttered, his voice trembling. I didn't argue. The rational part of me was slipping away, replaced by a primal fear that I couldn't control. We backed out of the room, but as we did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door, which we had left ajar, was slowly closing on its own, creaking ominously until it clicked shut. We ran, down the hall, through the main ward, past the nurse's station, and out the front door. We didn't stop until we reached the van, breathless and terrified. Inside the van, we found Sarah and Mark already waiting, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" I asked, but they shook their heads, refusing to speak. None of us said a word as we drove away from Cranbrook Asylum, the nightmarish experience replaying in our minds. Later, when we reviewed the footage, we found nothing. No sounds, no figures, nothing to prove what we had experienced. But I didn't need evidence anymore. I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. I never returned to Cranbrook. The asylum still stands, its windows dark and empty. But I know now that something lingers within its walls, something that defies explanation. The skeptic in me died that night, replaced by a man who knows that some things are best left forgotten, and some doors should never be opened. We'd always been the adventurous types, Emily and I. We loved the thrill of the unknown, the rush of exploring places few had ever seen. So when we decided to hike the Redwood National Park, it felt like the perfect escape. A chance to disconnect, to immerse ourselves in nature, to feel alive. We had no idea it would be our last adventure together. The morning we set out, the sun was shining. The sky was a perfect shade of blue, and the forest seemed inviting. We were prepared, our backpacks filled with enough supplies to last us the day, our spirits high. The towering redwoods were majestic, their sheer size almost incomprehensible. Walking among them made us feel small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was humbling in a way we both appreciated. The trail was well marked, easy to follow, and for the first few hours we moved at a leisurely pace, stopping often to take pictures or simply marvel at the beauty around us. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was, how serene. But that peace was an illusion, a thin veneer covering something much darker. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. It was Emily who first suggested we start heading back. I agreed, not wanting to be caught out here after dark. We turned around, retracing our steps along the trail, but something felt off. The trees, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now appeared menacing, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch us. The air had grown thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease was growing stronger with every step. "We should be getting close to the campsite by now," I said, trying to sound confident, though I could hear the doubt in my own voice. Emily didn't respond. She was scanning the trees, her eyes wide, her breath quickening. I knew she was scared, and that scared me even more. I picked up the pace, hoping that by moving faster, we'd snap out of whatever strange spell this place seemed to have cast over us. But the trail, once so clear, now seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't recognize. The trees grew denser, pressing in on us, and soon I realized we were lost. Panic gripped me, tightening my chest like a vice. "We need to go back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We need to find the main trail." "We're on it," I lied, though I knew it wasn't true. The path we were on was narrower, overgrown, and unfamiliar. But what choice did we have? I couldn't let her know how scared I was. As the last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the forest into darkness, we were forced to stop. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick blackness like a knife. The cold hit us then, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into our very bones. Emily clung to me, her body trembling. "Jake, I'm scared," she whispered, and it took everything in me to stay calm. "It's okay," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We'll find our way out. We just need to keep moving." But before we could take another step, we heard it. A low, rhythmic humming, barely audible at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, through my bones. It was accompanied by a low, guttural chanting, a sound so primal, so ancient, it filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. Emily squeezed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here, now." We ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about the path anymore, just desperate to put as much distance between us and that sound as possible. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The chanting was getting louder, closer, as if whatever was making it was following us. We stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed beneath a giant redwood, gasping for breath. The chanting had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then Emily saw it, a symbol carved into the trunk of the redwood above us, a spiral surrounded by strange, angular markings. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries, weathered by time, but still clearly visible. Something about it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread, a primal fear that I couldn't shake. What is that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, staring at the symbol. But deep down, I did know. This was a warning, a sign that we had ventured too far, that we were trespassing in a place we didn't belong. We tried to move, to get away from that tree, from that symbol, but it was as if the forest itself was against us. No matter which direction we tried, we always ended up back at that clearing, back at that tree. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and the sense of being watched more intense. Emily was crying now, and I held her close, trying to comfort her. But there was no comfort to be found. We were trapped, lost in a maze of trees that seemed to have a mind of their own. Then the humming started again, louder this time, closer. The chanting followed, and with it came a shadow, a figure moving through the trees, just out of sight. I could feel it watching us, feel its malevolent presence growing stronger. "We need to hide," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it was pointless. There was no hiding from this. Whatever it was, it had found us, and it wasn't going to let us go. The last thing I remember is the cold, the darkness, and Emily's hand slipping from mine as the chanting reached a deafening crescendo. And then nothing. Just an endless void of blackness, and the knowledge that we were lost forever in the heart of the redwood forest. No one ever found us. The search parties scoured the woods for weeks, but there was no trace of Emily or me. No footprints, no clothes, no signs that we had ever been there at all. But I know the truth. We weren't just lost in the woods. We were taken, swallowed by the darkness that lurks in the heart of that ancient forest, a darkness that doesn't let go.